Angola, Rwanda, Nigeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Ghana.
A true-born African.
The Dialogue Conference Inequality, a challenge for African-European cooperation, took place within the framework of the Austrian presidency of the European Union in Vienna on the 26th and 27th of November 2018. This conference was organized by the Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation, VIDC, and the Southern Africa Documentation and Cooperation Center, SADOCC. Inequalities are some of today's greatest challenges, which undermine poverty reduction and sustainable development and fuels insecurity, conflicts, and forced migration. Beside growing income and wealth inequalities within the European and African countries, the disparities between the two continents have grown significantly in recent decades. The conference aimed to gain a better understanding of local, national, and global drivers of inequality and to discuss political and institutional responses. Approximately 150 representatives from the African diaspora, public institutions, academia, and civil society organizations participated and worked out final conclusions which have been conveyed to the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, and to the Austrian Federal Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz. The European and Austrian political institutions are asked to include the issue of inequality in the ongoing post-Cotonou negotiations as one priority theme.
My name is Frank Schmidtler and I'm working at the VIDC and I'm in charge of the Africa Policy Desk. We started our Africa Dialogue program 8 years ago and we are focusing on European-African relations, democracy and especially social movements, and yes, it's a topic of course, migration, but also from the side of the positive side, diaspora engagement.
The key organizer representatives were Marc, Fähndrich, the head of the economic team of the House of the European Union in Vienna, who welcomed the 120 participants to the conference and stressed the need to strengthen the relationship beyond traditional development aid.
Welcome here at the premises of the European Commission and the European Parliament, in the House of the European Union. So it's a great pleasure for us that we can host this important event dealing with inequality between Europe and Africa. And for the beginning, maybe my name is Marc Fähndrich. I'm the head of the economic team within the representation. And so my normal business is not to talk about Africa, but I think it is becoming more and more important, and I will also tell you why. So, but just to come into the subject, a few reflections. So, democracy was born in Europe, but Africa is basically the cradle of mankind. And in the past, our relations were not always easy. They were characterized on the one side by the historic guilt of the European side, bearing in mind the suffering and victims of colonization. This was certainly not a relationship based on equality, so it was inequality. But on the other hand, we have to look forward in the future. And Africa and Europe are twin continents. This was made very clear by our president, Jean-Claude Juncker, in his regular annual State of the Union speech. And if we work together on a common future, we both will have a better future. And Africa clearly is the future. By 2050, Africa's population will number 2.5 billion, 5 times more than the current EU with 500 million people. And then 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. And this is, so it is in our interest to strengthen and improve our relationship. And also we have to stop seeing this relationship through the sole prism of development aid. And instead we need to work on a reciprocal and fruitful partnership. And reciprocal commitments are much better than donor-recipient relations. Thank you for your attention. I wish you a fruitful conference.
Sybille Straubinger, director of the VIDC, welcomed the international panelists and thanked the House of the European Union and the Austrian Development Agency for their cooperation. In her view, inequality is one of our biggest challenges today. It leads to social exclusion, tensions, insecurity, and is one of the root causes for migration.
Let me also say thank you to all our partners who made this conference happen, especially to the European Commission and the Austrian Development Agency for their financial support. Without it, this would not be ongoing. And thank you very much for this. Today and tomorrow we will talk about inequality. Inequality is one of our biggest challenges of today. It's leading to social exclusion, it leads to tensions and also to insecurity, and finally it's one of the root causes for migration. Inequality is not on the way to decrease, it's a rising phenomenon. And I think it's not only within countries, it's also between countries and between continents. So the question is, what can we do to reduce inequality between and among nations? How to include social issues to the policy of the European Union and the EU-Africa relations. That's what this conference is about. That's what we want to talk about at the dialogue at eye level, as it has a long tradition at the VIDC. It's not only a tradition, it's a principle, I think, of the Institute. And I think this will be part of today's and tomorrow's consultations. And I'm very grateful that we managed to bring so many interesting people together these 2 days, tonight and tomorrow. And I want to say a big thank you to the whole team of the VIDC and especially to Franz Schmidtjell, who organized this conference and had really a lot to do for the last weeks and a lot of troubles to get it all good in a good shape. And thank you very much for doing this conference in the framework of the Austrian presidency. You will see there Catherine Lutsch, she's also doing a graphic recording for the first time. I think this will be quite an interesting way to look over it at the end of this evening and to say what is the quintessence of all this what's discussed tonight. I wish you a very interesting and inspiring evening today, and maybe tomorrow as well, an interesting conference. Have a nice evening. Thanks for your attention.
Bernhard Bouzek is a board member of SADOCC, which is the successor of the anti-apartheid movement in Austria and continues solidarity work with Southern Africa, a region which is still suffering from the legacy of colonialism and apartheid, as well as from an unjust global order. Mr. Bozek mentioned the importance of political debate in cooperation with local partners instead of a charity approach.
Exactly 20 years ago, when Austria also had the presidency of the EU, SADOCC was co-organizing a conference called European Southern African Cooperation in a Globalizing World. It was hosted by the Austrian Parliament in cooperation with the European Network for Information and Action on Southern Africa on October 1998. The conclusion of this conference, 20 years ago, is as fresh and important as it can be. I quote, "We need an innovative approach to international cooperation that is able to meet the challenges of an increasingly interdependent world." You may ask yourself what has been reached in the last 20 years. As SADOCC, we focus a lot on South Africa and Namibia, two countries with the highest inequality within their societies, as it is shown in the famous Gini index, from super rich to very poor. Now, let's focus on the inequality in the relationship between Europe and Africa and find out what the EU can do to close this gap. Realizing that inequality and resulting poverty is a prime source of insecurity and instability, we both, the EU and Africa, should prioritize our policies to reduce and finally eradicate economic and social inequalities by addressing these roots. Once again, let me thank all organizers of this conference, and I wish you all an interesting debate and fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.
The conference consisted of various panels to further discuss and dissect the matters at hand. In the first panel, which headlined the theme of the state of inequality, the moderator, Marie-Roger Biloa, presented the panelists and referred in her introduction to inequalities everyone is confronted with on a daily basis in their private lives, business, and public sphere.
I think there is no single day when each of you has not been confronted with inequalities of all sorts, on a daily basis, in your private life, in the business, and in the public sphere. We will talk about as many aspects of them as possible, but let me just remind of one of the cases we've been hearing about in the past days, and concerning the wages of one of the big bosses in the automobile industry, Mr. Carlos Ghosn. I think you are aware of that. We heard so much about it. And I think it's a symbol of the world in which we are living now. He's earning 8,000 times more than the average worker in his company, Renault, in France. And we have been used to that. And we've come to believe that maybe this is ineluctable, but maybe normal, and that's something we have to accept. So when you have a case like what's happening and that because he gets into trouble, so he says maybe there's hope, that maybe at some point there are limits that they can remind from time to time that this sucks and this is not acceptable. So, inequalities are, as I said, something very common. And inequalities are, let's say, sister or brother of injustice. And that's what is interesting. Just to say that people are unequal, we are all unequal in this room. Some are tall, some are short, some are quiet, some are more intelligent, some not. So inequality is everywhere. So what we are dealing with today is the kind of inequalities which brings social injustice and probably also all kind of negative consequences in living together.
The first speaker, Leo Czajka, worked previously at the World Inequality Lab, which was initiated by Thomas Piketty on African inequality. He gave an overview of global and regional inequality trends.
So you can see just from the graph, but then I'll be a little bit more precise, there's this huge divide between regions. Now, this divide can be expressed in several ways. So, and I'll just read them, but in absolute terms, the difference has increased from $6,500 PPP, so at purchasing power parity, to 28,000. The relative difference has also increased, so meaning that average income in Europe has increased faster than in Africa. If you want to compare the distribution and not the averages, you see that actually 80% of Europeans earn on average 10 times more than 90% of African people. I think this is a striking figure. The levels reached in Africa now in 2017 are about as high as the levels which were the case in 1950. And regarding poverty, now that Asia has improved, more than half of the poor live in Africa, while a third of the global top 1% live in Europe. So in many ways to see how large inequality is between the two regions. And then these gaps are even larger if you consider not income per adult, but income per capita, and if you compare Africa not with global Europe, but with Western Europe.
Neeshan Balton, the executive director of the Ahmed of Katra Foundation in South Africa, added that Pravin Gordhan was the former commissioner for revenue services and later on a well-respected finance minister. As finance minister, he put the treasury, which is the key to pursuing development goals through allocations, at the heart of government to ensure that.
Well, on the one hand, you need to ensure that governance on the African continent is of the right order, and I think there are many countries that actually provide that at the moment. Secondly, we need to build the right institutions for delivery of the kind of services and the use of the technology that we are talking about. Thirdly, it's the development of human capital on the continent. And fourthly, it's about building institutions that would ensure urgency and delivery. And there are many such institutions on the African continent that can be strengthened, where greater synergies can in fact be created, and different kinds of financial formulae need to be found, which doesn't necessarily result in African countries finding themselves in debt again. So a unique brand of solidarity, if you like, which is not too dissimilar from the solidarity that Europeans experienced from the United States during World War I and World War II. In a very different kind of context, in order to address the dangers that they faced at that time as well. And what we have before us is not the risks, but more the opportunities that are available in order to do the right thing and to move the human spirit in a different, inclusive direction.
Neeshan Balton, the executive director of the Ahmed of Katra Foundation in South Africa, added that Pravin Gordhan was the former commissioner for revenue services and later on a well-respected finance minister. As finance minister, he put the treasury, which is the key to pursuing development goals through allocations, at the heart of government to ensure that.
As a result of affirmative action and empowerment, I think that you need to look at both of them, is really the affirming of people, black people, within the public and private space. That has been a huge program of government. Has it impacted on the poorest of the poor? I think not as much as it should have. And there is partly inefficiencies in government. Ideology plays a big part in terms of the role of the private sector, and that's an ongoing debate. But I think it's just pilferage, it's wasteful, waste has reduced the impact of that. So it could certainly have done much more. But I don't think empowerment and affirmative action has only benefited the small elite. Yes, there have been black elites who have become billionaires overnight. But there have been significant millions of black people who today have shares in public institutions that they would never have dreamt about 25 years ago.
Very interesting. It's good to set the record right because, you know, in West Africa, that's the picture we have. That there are some billionaires all over, you know, all of a sudden out of the blue, and nothing changes really deeply for the larger community. Now, Mr. Teixeira.
António Teixeira praised the EU for the most generous trade policy in the world. He noted that within the trade initiative Everything But Arms Policy, EBA, all products are charged a zero tariff except for weapons.
You mean if African countries remain too low, at a too low level, that will have an impact on the economy of European countries on the long run? That's what you mean?
No, I mean, what I mean is that, first of all, inequality, and contrary to poverty, inequality is a relative concept, right? So poverty is always bad because and cannot be tolerated. It's an absolute concept. Inequality naturally depends very much on the country's situation. But as you rightly said in the beginning of your presentation, we are all different. So in that sense, a certain degree of inequality is, inherent to the human condition. Yeah. And it is in fact necessary for a good, efficient allocation. The point is on the levels. It's when the level of inequality becomes extremely high, it's there that it's harmful for economic development, harmful for many other dimensions of sustainable development, in fact. The impact of high levels of inequality on environment, for instance, are well documented. So countries with high levels of inequality tend to cope less well to natural catastrophes than countries with, with more social cohesion. So in that sense, inequality, the high levels of inequality have in fact a negative impact on a number, if not all, SDGs.
Concerning the responsibility of African governments to find solutions, Ms. Adot Killmeyer-Oleche, a senior UNIDO expert from Kenya, mentioned the discontinuity of economic policies after a regime change and the lack of domestic accountability. She cited that new solutions need new technologies and skills, but they demand an institutional and infrastructural support that is unmanageable for certain countries.
I've been in this business now for over 30 years. Invariably, when a regime changes in an African country, the entire priorities for economic development also shift. And the things that take precedence become political goals, whatever those may be, to develop the region from which the president comes from might be one of them. Those things are the things that then determine what the policy priorities are. So my take on this is that governments have a responsibility and they should stick with these responsibilities, that the role of politics in deciding what the economic development path is, that should be diminished. Because if a regime is there for 5 years and a new one comes after 5 years, you cannot continue. The continuity of economic development policies is longer than the political life of a regime. So these types of considerations also have to come in. In addition to that, coming from the United Nations, that's where I've worked most of my life. There you are at the heart of the complications, because you have a donor who has all kinds of accountability issues with the funds to the taxpayer. In that part of the world, you have the recipient of this taxpayer's money, which is an African government or an Asian government or a Latin American government and so on, which also has their own priorities like I've just described. And you have the population of needy, hardworking, needy but very hardworking populations who are not really in this discussion. And when you have that type of a dialogue taking place, the forces that make the decisions may make all the work seem rather meaningless, because you're constantly discussing the same thing. And it's a paradox, I think. There's no clear answer. We can all see inequality. We've been shown just now. Where the gaps are bigger are in very rich countries. And in some of those rich countries, the US, they're comparable to an African country in terms of the degree of inequality. So there's a problem there. And that leads me to think that what the minister said about looking for new solutions and new lenses to look at this issue, it's important. We cannot use the same old ways that we've done it. And now to make things even more complicated, the technological divide is also growing wider. We're getting robotics coming into play, we're getting cloud computing, and the skills around this, what they demand in terms of institutional and infrastructural support, is unimaginable for a country like Chad or Burkina Faso. So I think there's a lot more to this discussion on inequality. And we should, I think, also forgive ourselves for our mistakes, but it doesn't mean we keep doing the same thing. I think the thing is to learn from our mistakes and try and generate new solutions. The colonialism story is not ending now. It's not improving, it's not changing. Let's not go back there. I think we need to look beyond where the mistakes have been made and try and come up with new solutions and ideas.
So maybe let's take questions, comments. So Walter?
Walter Sauer, co-organizer of the conference, referred to Minister Gordhan, suggesting that EU-Africa relations need to be rethought, which implies that past cooperation did not produce the expected results. In conclusion, the moderator concluded with reference to the African rising myth.
As the boss said, he has a very hard time organizing all this. Mr. António Teixeira, you had a tough time too, but I think it was very interesting, and we are very grateful for your contribution. And Mr. Neeshan Balton from the Ahmed Foundation, I think it was very interesting, the insights into the South African society. And Madam Adot Killmeyer-Oleche of UNIDO, I hope your own weight in the UNIDO can help change some of the things we need to change there. And the youngest, the Benjamin, Leo Czajka, thank you for this, what we call the scientific part, and for your insights. Mesdames et messieurs, thank you for listening, and I hope you find this was interesting and that it will help you think further on the issue. Merci beaucoup.
Part 2 of this conference continues in our second episode on Radio Africa TV, where participants and guest speakers got together in workshop groups to discuss the matters raised during the panel discussion at length.
Ça va aller, ça va aller, ça va aller. Ça va aller, ça va aller, ça va aller. Tout le monde. Petit pays, avocat défenseur des femmes. Le seul, l'unique au monde entier, cela se sait.